Hello and welcome to Forgotten Voices of the Second World War by Max Arthur. Read by me, Daniel Stelling. We are up to part 5, Dunkirk. Dun dun dun, Kirk. Always remember that. Put the ducky there. Okie dokie. Without further ado, let's go, shall we? Dunkirk. The British Expeditionary Force was in retreat, in a degree of disarray and haste that demanded that the men abandon much of their equipment in order to save themselves. The last week of May saw the retreating British and French armies assembling on the beaches at Dunkirk. The first priority was to save the men to fight another day, to transport them back to Britain to regroup. It was a seemingly impossible undertaking, but with the massed efforts of the Royal Navy and private vessels of every description, large and small, a total of 338,226 British and French troops were brought back to British shores between the 26th of May and 4th of June. God bless you, fellas. Hitler's troops failed to press home their obvious advantage and did not annihilate the retreating British. Might come back to kick you in the butt there, old Adolf. Let's see, shall we? One of the last lifts of troops took place on the 17th of June from Saint-Nazaire by the Lancastria, which was sunk by German bombs. Churchill was at pains to remind the nation that the war was not won by evacuations. However, most of the army had been rescued. There was something to build on for the forthcoming conflict. Squadron leader, Al Deer, New Zealander, 54 Squadron RAF. Station commander, Boy Bouchier, assembled all the pilots in the billiards room in the officers' mess to tell us that we'd been assigned to take part in the protection of the British troops over Dunkirk. For 14 days, we went non-stop. I did something like 37 hours in 10 days. We just kept flying. We had no reserve pilots. Ordinary seaman, Dick Coppard, Royal Navy. At Portland, we were given a night's leave, so we went ashore, picked up a couple of wafts and took them to the pictures. While we were there, they flashed on the screen for all the personnel of the ships in the harbour to return to their ships immediately. Eventually, we found out that we were going over to France to pick up the troops. We were told to carry on to Fee Camp and embark as many people from the jetties as we could. Most of them were stretcher cases and walking wounded. They looked like a beaten army. They weren't really, but they looked it. Some were from the 51st Highland Division, a few French, and a regiment from the Midlands. We cleared the mess decks to make room for the stretchers. The walking cases were pushed into corners. There were 200 or 300 of them on board, plus about 60 of us crew. We tried to feed them, but the food ran out. At one point, we had to take bread off some French soldiers who didn't want to share it around. Bloody French, hoarding all the bread. But they seemed shocked and were very, very quiet. I don't think they realised what was happening to them. A lot of them had never seen warfare. We got the chaps off at Portsmouth. Those that could walk marched off the jetty, heads up and shoulders back. Corporal Elizabeth Kell. WAF, on liaison duties, running the phone line into Dunkirk. I'd be rather ashamed to say it, but it put the fear of God into me. We knew where the Huns were. We had maps with pins in, and they seemed to be advancing very fast. The Dunkirk crisis itself was unbelievable. A lot of people coming back had jettisoned their guns and vehicles. They were just pouring through. I think the officers at the other end of the phone were largely confined to their building, but they could see very clearly what was going on. It was absolute mayhem. Dunkirk was full of people who had mostly walked there, not in any form of order. They had just got there as fast as they could. Some had hitched lifts wherever possible. There were lots of refugees coming in. It had been bombed. We knew that lots of the troops were sheltering in the buildings along the shore. We had no idea that they were going to be rescued. It seemed the whole army was going to be captured. I was extremely upset. It never occurred to me that we would survive. I thought we were defeated, and quite frankly, thought we would surrender and sue for peace. Lieutenant Bruce Jr., on leave from HMS Ajax. The commander rang me up to report at once, with my boots and gaiters on, and prepared to go overseas. I dashed back to Chatham, where I and another officer went into Admiralty car to Ramsgate, and boarded an old destroyer, HMS Wolfhound. We crossed the Channel under heavy attack by bombers, but we landed on the jetty at Dunkirk. A British naval officer was giving the orders, but Captain Tennant was in overall charge from a dugout at the landward edge of the jetty, or mole, which was roughly 400 yards long. For the first 48 hours, I was never off my feet. Soldiers came from scattered units and in small groups under command, all shattered and dispirited from fighting and marching with no food or rest. Montgomery, the divisional commander, marched the troops by night and handled the divisions so well to manage to evacuate so very many soldiers. Good old Monty. The Admiralty got hold of Dutch troops, which were robust, petrol-powered, large open barges with powerful engines designed to carry cargo in the Dutch inland waterways. For the evacuation, they were manned by British naval personnel, and of course were so useful because of their very shallow draft, which enabled them to get up to the root of the pier. The destroyers could only safely reach the end of the jetty, and then only at high water. The evacuation of the beaches was a magnificent bit of organisation, but it has gone down in history that the whole of the British Expeditionary Force came off on Dunkirk beaches, which is nonsense. 30 to 40,000 men were evacuated from the beaches by little ships, which was a magnificent effort. It was, however, a drop in the ocean compared to the evacuation by the Royal Merchant Navy from the jetty of some 220,000 men. Yeah. So he's claiming the little ships didn't do as much as the Navy did. I wonder who will win that argument. That's quite a good one. I like that. Francis Codd, Auxiliary Fire Service in London, aboard the Massey Shore, a shallow draft firefighting ship based on the Thames. From about a mile away, still no aeroplanes, no bombs, no menace. Then we could see it was a flat beach, a sandy beach. And then we saw the silhouette of houses against the sky, the setting sun. We couldn't see what was going on the beach. We gradually saw reflections on the calm water, and I thought I could see a wrecked small craft, and then a bigger craft. Gradually we could see dark shapes against the sand, and then we saw that there were hundreds, thousands of people on this sand, and stretching up to the line of the houses which stood presumably on the road that ran along the coast. It was an extraordinary sight. Nothing seemed to be happening. They didn't seem to be moving in any organised way, not marching. They were standing or sitting, but mainly we noticed that they were columns of men stretching down into the sea. We didn't really understand what this was at first, and then suddenly it occurred to us that these were columns of men waiting to be picked up. The first man in the sea was the next man to be picked up. Good old British, we love a queue, don't we? One of our auxiliaries, China Wright, was a good swimmer, and he went from the Massey shore some 50 to 100 yards to a wrecked boat which was right inshore in about 2 or 3 feet of water. He swam with what we called the grass line, which is a rope that floats on water, and he tied it to the wreck so that we had a fixed line into the shallow water. Now there were lots of little rowing boats in the water, mainly sunk or not being used. So they got a rowing boat that would hold a few people, a light rowing boat, and worked it along the line, pulling hand over hand. When we got organised, this worked very well. Whoever was in charge of the column of men lined up near the shore end of the line detailed 6 men into their rowing boat to pull along the line till they reached the Massey shore, climb out on board, and send their rowing boat back for another half dozen. In that way, I think we took aboard 36 soldiers out of the water that night. Ordinary Seaman Stanley Allen, aboard HMS Windsor. A megaphone asked if there was anyone who could volunteer to crew up a fishing boat, where some of the crew had been machine gunned. This boy of 17, who'd been sunk twice that day, volunteered immediately. Go on, lad. He got cheered by the sailors and the soldiers who were on board. And me. One old 3-badge able seaman, which meant he'd had 13 years of undetected crime, said to me, "With youngsters like that, how can we effing well lose?" And really, it was something. It did us the world of good. It was a real tonic that this boy, who had gone down twice in that morning, instead of coming back to England to his family, volunteered again. What I couldn't have helped marvelling about, as well, was how the soldiers, who were very tired and hungry, were squatting down, sending rapid fire up at the aircraft. I took my hat off to them, and everyone did. Some Spitfires appeared, and a couple of Stukas got shot down. They were cheered into the sea, but our first lieutenant, after the incident was over, he appealed to the soldiers. "Please don't fire, because you're putting our machine gunners on the bridge in jeopardy with your enthusiasm." He said it so calmly and nicely that all the soldiers laughed. As we were going out with these boats, it came to me, and it came to a lot of us, that we'd had a heck of a pasting the day before, and today. We must be untouchable. Nothing could hit us. It was a rather strange feeling that we got through, and we were going to get through again. When we got on alongside at Dunkirk and secured a file of Scottish soldiers who were wearing khaki aprons over their kilts came along, led by an officer who got his arm in a sling. He called out to the bridge, "What part of France are you taking us to?" One of our officers called back, "We're taking you back to Dover." So he said, "Well, we're not bloody well coming." They turned round and went back to continue their war with the Germans on their own. It was something remarkable. God bless them. The Crested Eagle, the old London pleasure ship, which had used to go between Tower Bridge down to Clacton, was a hospital ship, painted up with a red cross. She'd been bombed and settled in the water, but the German aircraft were still machine gunning her. That wasn't really cricket in our book. There was no real hatred about the Germans, really, except that they just weren't playing the game. That wasn't the right way to win a war. To have a go at wounded people. Bloody Germans. There was a little dog, a terrier-type mongrel, who came on board with some of the soldiers. He had a harness on him with pouches. He only understood French. When I spoke to him, he wouldn't leave me. That little dog came back with us on the other 2 trips that we made. He didn't understand any English, which rather tickled some of the soldiers. One of our sub-lieutenants felt that Kirk, as we called him, should not be destroyed to keep to the necessary anti-rabies laws. So after Dunkirk was over, Kirk was collected by a PDSA van to go into quarantine for 6 months before, as the sub-lieutenant put it, being taken on the staff of the parish where his father was a vicar. All of us cheered the old dog off. It was a very nice human touch among all the carnage of Dunkirk, as though people, in spite all of war, were still caring. The other thing was seeing all the soldiers coming back without their equipment. We began to think it was a sort of end of war, end of our way of life. We didn't know how long we'd be able to hold Jerry off in England. We knew we had the Navy and that they would fight, but we didn't know what the soldiers would be able to do if Jerry had landed, because they had nothing left. Ordinary Seaman Douglas Stevens, signaller aboard HMS Salem. I think it was on the 24th of May, round about midnight, I was called to the bridge, as there was a flashing light coming from Cap Gris-Nez. It turned out to be an SOS. We waited for daylight, and then we could see that there was a lot of troops all clustered around Cap Gris-Nez, up the cliffs and on the beach. Cap Gris-Nez? How do you pronounce that? We could see someone was trying to semaphone with flags to us, asking if we could send a boat to take off troops as they were trapped. There were German tanks in the woods behind Cap Gris-Nez, and they were shelling them. We saw quite a lot of bodies, mainly French troops. They appeared to have their tin hats and full pack on when they drowned in the water. I know it's a bit gruesome, because they were in a very bloated condition, and we had orders to stick boat hooks in them and sink them, which is what we did. On one occasion, the whole convoy was attacked by about 70 Stukas. I got wounded in the left arm, and the gun layer got badly wounded in his leg. The skipper was killed right alongside me. We heard afterwards it was a cannon shell from one of the Stukas. We were in a sinking condition, and the tugs came out from Dover and tied themselves alongside us and dragged us back into Dover harbour. Excuse me. Where did I put my drink? I've lost it. Anyway, we carry on. Sergeant Edward Doe, 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps. On the 24th of May, we were advancing in an open formation up along the main road, when all of a sudden a machine gun opened up, and the left and the right of our formation simply disappeared. They were down. It was awful. It was plain murder, and by God, I was scared. It was devastating. We in the centre got away with it. My goodness me, I shall remember that to my dying day. When the German soldiers came towards us, he just had his jackboots on, a belt around his waist, a canister on the side of him, and a water bottle. He wasn't lumbered down, he wasn't tied down with packs and equipment like we were, and furthermore, he was armed with a Tommy gun. We had to fire one shot and then eject the cartridge and reload again. It was an awful situation to be in. We were not only outnumbered, we were outarmed in every way. It was, quite frankly, a bloodbath. By the 27th, they were closing in all the time, gradually eliminating, mopping up pockets here and there. We were desperately short of ammunition. There were chaps pleading for ammunition and being told, "I'm sorry, you can't have none of mine. I might need what I've got." That was the situation. The Germans had brought the tanks in, and they were blasting. They knew when they brought those damn great big tanks in, that was it. I actually fired the boys' anti-tank rifle for the first time in my life. A terrifying weapon. To even fire, you had to hang on to it, like grim death, because it would dislocate your shoulder if you didn't. I fired at a tank coming over the bridge that wasn't blown, and I couldn't miss it from about 50 yards away. An officer was right beside me, and I saw this hit the tank, and all it had done was just about knock the paintwork off. It made a noise like a little ping-pong ball. The officer who was beside me said, "Leave the blasted thing there. Oh, get the hell out of it." And we did, and only just in time. We scarpered quick. We just disappeared off the other side of the bridge, only just in time, because this fella opened up, and he blew half the coping off the bridge off, with his terrible big gun on the front of the tank. I finished up with a group of about 8 chaps in a railway shed, which was more than half full of women and children, mainly French, all huddled there. All of a sudden, everything went quiet, and we heard a voice somewhere at the back of the shed say, "Come out." Perfect English too. "You haven't got a chance. If you're not out within 5 minutes, we'll blow you to pieces." So we just walked out, a dozen of us, just left our rifles where they were. I had the sense to remove the bolt from the rifle and chucked it. We went out with our hands up in the air, and there they were. The chap that had called us up was a young German officer. He called us the swine, the pigs. We didn't. And why we didn't give in? We were foolish. Oh dear, oh dear. The first thing they did was to take our rings and watches off us. My watch was a wedding present. I also lost a gold wedding ring. We were assured, when they were taken off us, that we'd get them back at the end of the war. But we knew darn well we wouldn't. Plainly wouldn't. I even had some family pictures taken off me. And the German looked at them and tore them up and chucked them onto the floor at his feet. I could have annihilated him. Just torn them up. Just contempt. Bloody Germans. Sergeant Leonard Howard, 210 Field Company, Royal Engineers. We were making our way from the brewery of Fletcher to Dunkirk when we had to cross a road open to enfilade by the Germans. We could only cross one at a time. You had to pick your spot and take your chance. I crossed this road behind a driver, Wheeler, who got some 8 feet in front of me when he was hit in the stomach by a machine gun. As I got almost up to him, a further burst of fire took off the top of his head, literally in front of me. Ugh. Had it not been for him, I would have hit the burst. So in many ways, I always think that poor Wheeler, who'd brought it in, who bought it anyway saved my life. On the night of the 29th, 30th of May, we left Fletcher and then started our 40-mile trek to Dunkirk. We walked and ran throughout that night, and indeed all the next day. One was continually making diversions to miss the enemy. I remember there was a Captain Whitty who had been shot through the chest, an amazingly brave man. He was leading quite a sizable group of infantry, and for a while we tagged on. It was a case of every man for himself. It was chaotic. The Germans were very close, and people were being killed. At 21 years old, one hadn't experienced death and people being killed, so it was a bit frightening. Survival, of course, was the main object in everyone's mind. I saw an RSM walking down the road. He was in his knee breeches and his service dress, jacket and cap, and the tears were streaming down his face. He said, "I never thought that I'd see the British Army like this." And I always remember him, poor man, was absolutely shattered. He was a regular soldier, and the tears were streaming down his face. We got into Dunkirk around 5 o'clock in the evening. We hadn't eaten, and it was really chaos. The sand was littered with bodies and crowds of chaps, all hoping to get off. I was exhausted, and I went to sleep. I lay in the sand of the dunes, and I slept, because I really was completely exhausted. The next morning, my mate, Bill Baldry, was still around, and he and I went into the water, hoping to get picked up, but there was no hope. They tried to organise queues, but it was very difficult. People were not only being stookered, they were being also panic on the beaches on themselves. But there was also panic on the beaches themselves. I saw British men shoot British troops. On one occasion, a small boat came in, and they poled aboard it in such a degree that it was in danger of capsizing. The chap in charge of his boat decided he must take some action. He ordered one man who was hanging on the side to get away, but he didn't, so he shot him through the head. From the people around, there was no reaction at all. There was such chaos on the beach that it didn't seem to be able to keep him. There were chaps who were going round the bend. I saw chaps run into the water screaming because mentally it had got too much for them. I was wearing a battle dress blouse and slacks, and it was bitterly cold at night. I came out of the water and I removed a corporal's overcoat from a corpse on the beach. They landed some beach masters who were in service dress, and they had red bands on their arms, trying to organise the evacuation. They'd come over from the UK to try and organise the queues on the beach. Well, frankly, the chaps who'd made it to Dunkirk didn't want chaps in service dress and Sam Browns and red bands round their arms trying to organise them into queues. There was a very flimsy canoe, and two chaps paddled out on this canoe. A stooker had come down and machine gunned them, and they both leaned the same way, and they were both drowned. Plop. The canoe was upside down, and it was floating some way off the beach. Bill swam up to this canoe and pulled it ashore, and we emptied it of water, got a couple of spades off an abandoned lorry, and we paddled out. HMS Whitehall came past us with its gun blazing away at these stookers, threw us a line, and we were pulled aboard. It's safe. Flying Officer Geoffrey Page, 56 Squadron, RAF. Our operations over Dunkirk fell into two main categories. One was that we would do a fighter sweep. We would sweep all the way around, behind the beaches, and try to intercept any German aircraft coming up to attack the soldiers on the ground. In the other role, we would escort a bomber called the Blenheim, and be their fighter escort, and when they went to bomb the targets that were related to the evacuation from Dunkirk. I think our ground crews were the people who got into more fisticuffs in local pubs. Because after a few beers, the soldiers would say, "Where were you?" And our ground crews knew very well that we'd gone over there. They'd just been busy. Corporal Henry Palmer, 1 and 7th Battalion, Queen's Royal Regiment. The beach was one vast sea of bodies. I'd never seen so much dejection. Soldiers felt that they had been left there. Some seemed to have given up, but personally I didn't. There was one place I was going, and that was back to England. There was panicking, but most of us managed to keep our heads. One chap scrounged a tin of bully beef and laid it out like a picnic, tucked his napkin in, then apologised he couldn't supply the wine because the butler happened to be away that day. Good old British spirit, we love it, we did. Oh. Captain Anthony Rhodes, 253 Field Company, Royal Engineers. About an hour after the setting of the sun came the familiar drone, as the Luftwaffe came along and dropped flares so they could see us. The sky was alight as they dropped their bombs. Where the boats came in, there was a little nucleus at the head of the water, and then a great queue, running up from the dunes behind, perhaps a quarter of a mile. The idea was just like a London bus queue. Nobody told us to do that. It just seemed the decent thing to do. There must have been about 10 or 12 of these queues running up. When we were halfway up in our queue, the bombing started, and one man ran to the head of the queue when he saw a boat coming. A naval officer turned to him and said, "Look, go back to the place you've come from, or I'll shoot you." He said it very loudly for everyone to hear, and the man went back with his tail between his legs. We'd been on the fishing boat, I suppose about an hour, at the most. We were trying to lie down. We hadn't had any sleep for several days. When a cry came up, all of the men who'd been rescued and were on the fishing boat were to be transferred to a destroyer. When we got on board, an officer came round and said, "We shall shortly be sailing for Blighty, England, home and beauty." I went right down into the hold, where I was put into a hammock because I was dead. We all were. At Dover, when we arrived, there was a whole series of trains. All the units had been dispersed, and one hadn't got a clue of one's own men. One was isolated, and we were simply told, "Each of you get on the train and get up to London. You'll find the RTO at Waterloo, and he'll tell you that you'll have a couple of days to go home, where you're to assemble to join your new units." So we went up in the trains. They were full of civilians who got in and who were going to their offices in London. Sitting next to you, there might be a man who was going up to his bank. One very nice man, a civilian, pressed into my hand 2 half-crowns, which was rather nice. Leon Wilson, French soldier retreating from Belgium into France. Oh, we were fortunate, so fortunate. We had said thank you to England 1,000 times for sending the little boats to take us to the big boats, the destroyers, to take us back to England. I was on the beach for 2 days, and it was so horrible. We seemed to be walking on dead bodies, not on sand. It is very hard to describe, just walking on bodies. But at 10 o'clock in the evening, we reached a little boat, which should have usually take about 6 people, but there must have been about 20 people on it already. We were very fortunate that the boat took us. It took us onto an English destroyer. I shall never forget the captain, who was one of the nicest gentlemen you could ever wish to meet. He said, "Come on, frogs, sit down and have something to eat." He was a good joke at the moment. He told us, "Eat what you want." And we sat down to eat, and it was such that it was better than any meal at the Savoy today. Bacon, cheese, everything. It was a joy to us. Coxswain Thomas King, aboard the HMS Sharpshooter. On the way into the beaches, our captain hailed a ship that was coming out with troops and said, "How many are in there?" The reply that he got back was, "There's bloody thousands." There was no order on the first occasion at all. It was more or less a free-for-all. Soldiers don't know the life-saving capacity of boats. We could only take 10 to 12 in a whaler, and so we kept our distance from the water's edge, because it was no good us going right up to the beach, because we'd got to get seaborne again. On the second night we went in. There was the order. There was an officer at the head, and he called out, "Coxswain, how many do you want?" And I would tell him, and he would count them off. Any wounded, they would pass over their heads, and you'd have to take them first. Squadron leader, oh dear, 54 Squadron, RAF. Picture of the man right there. New Zealander. On 31st of May, I was leading the squadron, and just as we arrived over Dunkirk, a Dornier 17 came flying up the coast. We went after it, and being the leader, I was the first one there. I was lining up behind to shoot it, when the rear gunner fired. He hit my engine and the glycol header tank, which is in the cooling system. I had to break off and crash landed north of Dunkirk. The tide was out, and I got down onto the beach, but I knocked myself out on the edge of the windscreen. When I came to, I got out and was looked after by a girl who stitched me up with an ordinary needle and put a plaster on me. Then I headed for Dunkirk, where I knew the BEF was intending to evacuate. We had been reading in the newspapers that the British Army was retreating according to plan, somewhere en route to Dunkirk. I went into a small cafe where I saw two Tommies. I asked them, "Am I heading for the army of Dunkirk?" They looked at me and said something to the effect of, What British army? There's no retreat, chum. There's a bloody chaos." Dunkirk was a complete shambles. Burning buildings, abandoned vehicles and falling masonry. Bernd Engelmann, Luftwaffe pilot. Bernd. On the beaches and in the dunes of Dunkirk, thousands of light and heavy weapons lay in the sand, along with munitions crates, field kitchens, scattered cans of rations, and innumerable wrecks of the British Army trucks. "Damn," I explained to Irwin. "The entire British Army went under here." Irwin shook his head vigorously. "On the contrary, a miracle took place here. If the German tanks and Stalkers and the Navy had managed to surround the British here, shooting most of them and taking the rest prisoner, then England wouldn't have any trained soldiers left. Instead, the British seem to have rescued them all. And a lot of Frenchmen too. Adolf can say goodbye to his blitzkrieg against England." Bern obviously knew his stuff. He wasn't daft. Sergeant Peter Vinicum, wireless operator, 98 Squadron, RAF, aboard troopship Lancaster. Roughly 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 17th of June, the sirens went again from somewhere. We think the destroyers. There was an instant attack with guns going off near us. At the time, I was at the base of a funnel, and there was a terrific bang and a blast which blew me off my feet, straight into the lap of an army officer. Another bomb went off and the ship lurched. He cleared off with his soldiers in rather a panic, and I got kicked in the face as they went. The ship started heeling over. Another bomb went off. I suppose we got 3 because I wasn't counting anymore, but I can remember these huge explosions. As the ship was going over, so loose kit and things on deck started sliding. So did the people who weren't holding on to anything. There came an announcement from someone on the bridge to transfer our way to the other side of the ship, which we did, and she righted. But in the writing, herself of course, the extra weight made her go over towards the other side, and she went over again. Then we got the same order. Machinery, like trucks, guns, stuff that was on the deck, human beings, all hurtled down into the rails of the ship and into the water. One of my most vivid pictures is of the big mast of the ship running parallel to the water. People were running along this and jumping off. I saw a rope and I grabbed it, not realising at the time that it was attached to the ship. However, I couldn't swim, so I had to get hold of something that would keep me afloat. There were all these kit bags, so I grabbed an oar between my legs and a kit bag under each arm and just floated there. Ordinary seaman Frank Brogden, crewman aboard the troopship Lancaster. Aboard the same ship. There seemed to be thousands and thousands of people in the water, and unfortunately, with this ship having had the attack earlier on, the fuel tanks were damaged. We had a terrific amount of oil fuel, which is almost like tar. Men were stuck in this oil fuel, clinging to various bits of wreckage. After about an hour, the attackers came over again, and they strafed us with machine gun fire. The various ships came in to pick up troops. I'd been in the water approximately 5 hours, but in the meantime I'd come across an old broken ladder or some wood, and I was clinging onto that, which I was very pleased about, because although the life jacket keeps your head above the water, it's very nice to get hold of something. I was picked up by a French tug, whose crew just threw a hook out and dragged us in. I must have been in a sorry mess, as I was black from head to toe. They gave us a mug of hot wine, very sweet red wine, and I was immediately very sick. This seemed to bring quite a lot of the oil fuel up. I found out afterwards that's why they gave it to us. They must have had this experience before. Corporal Donald Draycott, fitter, 98 Squadron, aboard the troopship Lancaster. Again, same ship. They're not having much luck on this ship, are they? We were practically the last to embark on the Lancaster. By this time, she had round out about 6,000 troops and air force on board. By this time, she had round about 6,000 troops and air force on board. Sorry. We were assigned to palisades right on the bottom of the hold. It was pretty grim, and having a strong sense of self-preservation, I thought, well, on the trip home, if we get attacked by submarines or hit by a mine, we wouldn't have a chance down here, particularly if the lights have all gone out. The ship was old, with no proper working gangways like an ordinary troop ship, and I realised we'd have difficulty getting out if we got into trouble. So I decided to stay on the top deck. When she was hit, I went to the bow of the ship to have a look back, and she was sinking slowly in the water. So I said to this chap, well, I'm a swimmer, I'm over the side. I just looked down to about a 30-foot drop, took my tin helmet off, my uniform, my boots, clutched my paybook and my French francs, and jumped feet first over the side. When I broke the surface, I was right up against the ship's plates, so I decided to strike out away from her. I swam about 100 yards and came across a plank, which looked as if it had been blown off one of the hatches. So I sat on that, and the thing that surprised me was how calm I felt. I thought, well, I'll sit on this, you'll never see anything like this again, and have a grandstand view. So I sat on this hatch cover and turned back and looked at the ship. 50 yards away from me, men were singing, roll out the barrel. Good old British spirit, that's it. Private William Tilley, clerk with the base depot, Royal Army Service Corps. It's something that you look back on with astonishment, that from the little trawler which picked us up, we were able to watch the final lurching and sinking of the Lancaster. She overturned completely in the end, so you could see the propellers, and even then you could see men standing on her upturned bows, afraid to jump in the sea, and even try to propel themselves away. That was a pretty awful sight to behold, because you realised that when she went down, they would just be sucked down with her. That was awful. Corporal Frank Horrell, 3rd Field Army Workshop, RAOC. What's that? Royal... No, I'm not going to embarrass myself. Tell me what the RAOC is in the comments. When we got into Dover, we were put into old custom sheds. In these, there were these ladies from the Women's Services, the Red Shield Club, all the various ladies' associations. Well, I had no tunic, I'd lost it, and one of the elderly ladies took off her fur coat and put it round me whilst I sat down, and gave me a cup of tea. Then she produced a stamped envelope, stamped and sealed, and she said, right, the address is to go to your wife or whoever. Put the message on the back, use it like a postcard. It will get there quicker. Picture of all the chaps cramming into the boats there. Lady Anne Chichester, civilian volunteer worker in Hampshire. My husband, who was in the Guards, was in retreat, and he was picked up by a yacht with a lot of other Welsh Guardsmen and brought back to England. They left every single thing they possessed except their guns, even their sleeping bags, their clothes, their equipment. They just got on board any ship that was able to take them back to England. At the time, knowing the French had given up the fight and the Germans were all along the coast of France, we really did think that any day they would be invading us. Reverend John Duffield, former Padre on the Western Front, 1914 to 18, chaplain of Oncham internment camp. When our people had to come home from Dunkirk, it was thought that something had to be done about all the Germans who were in the country, and about whom they didn't know very much. So, in a bold step, it was decided to intern them all on the Isle of Man, which was selected because of its holiday resort atmosphere. Sorry. In my parish, a great chunk of it was wired off, ready for internees. On the great day, hundreds would march into the camp. Senior Aircraftman James Merritt, Ground Gunner, RAF. I went into the pub the first night I came back from France, and the landlord said to me, "Oh, we thought you'd been took prisoner." And old Bill, the postman, took one look along the bar and he said, I told you, if there's only one bugger to come back, it'll be him. Nice. Captain Francis Barclay, 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment. The first thing I'd pay tribute to is the men and the morale that we had in this battalion, which was absolutely wonderful. It was the most thrilling feeling to experience the spirit of the chaps who were with you. We had tremendous respect for the courage of our men and the way that they held out when the Dunkirk withdrawal was going on. They never got to Dunkirk themselves. They were stopping the Germans interfering with the withdrawal of thousands and thousands of other people, which they did successfully. The battalion was practically wiped out doing it. God bless these boys. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, the Battle of Berlin. The Battle of Britain. Wrong one. Berlin's about 4 years later. 5 years later. Okay, so that was Dunkirk. Remember that. Please like, subscribe. Next video. That one. See you next time.